Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. This episode is my fifth in a mini-series of 9 episodes focusing on the scholarship of the 2019 Sacred Rites cohort. Sacred Rites provides support, resources, and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend checking out their fantastic work on Twitter at sacred_rites or online at sacred-rites.org. It has been a joy featuring the work so far of Dr. Tia Pratt, Dr. Brian Kleitz, Dr. Vicki Brennan, Dr. Shrina Gandhi, and Dr. Kayla Wheeler through the first part of the series, and I am so excited to bring you the next batch of episodes. The ways religious groups engage with politics varies widely. Some religions discourage outright political participation, and some encourage direct support of specific political parties and candidates. Following religion in American politics is deeply fascinating, and there are many fantastic journalists and scholars who cover such work. One scholar who studies the political engagement of American Muslims is Dr. Sajida Jalalzai, and she is my guest on this episode. In this conversation, we discuss the ways the presidential candidacy of Bernie Sanders drew the attention of American Muslims. We also discuss the Islamic Society of North America gathering and what it is like being an American Muslim who also studies Islam as a scholar. In this conversation, we discuss her Washington Post article, Bernie Sanders Has Brought Out the Muslim Vote in Ways I've Never Seen Before, in depth, and you can find that article linked in the show notes. Dr. Sajida Jalalzai is an assistant professor of religion at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. She is an expert in the study of North American Islam. Jalalzai earned her PhD from Columbia University, specializing in American religions. She is currently writing a book on Muslim leadership education in 3 Protestant Christian seminaries in the United States and Canada. You can follow her work on Twitter at twitter.com/Sajida Jalalzai, and you can find Classical Ideas on Twitter at classical_ideas. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to bring you my conversation with Dr. Sajida Jalalzai. Dr. Sajida Jalalzai, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am delighted to have you here. I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit.
Great. So my name is Sajida Jalalzai. I'm an assistant professor of religion at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. And I'm an expert in the study of North American Islam. I earned my PhD from Columbia University, where I specialized in American religions and Islam within that category. And I am currently writing a book on Muslim leadership education in the US and Canada.
Wonderful. Do you have a timeline for that book project?
I don't have a concrete timeline, but I'm on academic leave in the fall, so I hope to get a lot of work done at that point.
That is so cool. So I'm always interested in talking to folks who appear on the show about why they do what they do, and kind of tracing that story back to where this all began. I'm curious if you can describe your academic path to becoming interested in North American Islam. Like, what were some crucial stepping stones and turning points along your journey that stand out to you as crucial?
Sure. Well, I am one of those students who decided that they were really interested in religious studies in undergrad, which I think is, I think it's kind of rare. But I received a really wonderful undergraduate education at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And the religious studies department there offers a really broad range of courses. So I was taking everything from Hebrew Bible and New Testament to, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, basically everything, as well as all of the traditions that religion departments usually offer, and some thematic courses like religion and violence, religion and film. And so I was just really inspired by that education, and I decided to go and get a master's degree. So that master's degree, I ended up at McGill University in Canada.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I knew I wanted to focus on Islam, but I also wanted to retain that kind of comparative element as well. So I decided to focus on Islam and Hinduism in the South Asian context. So I got my master's, and I made the decision to work for a period of time, but I wanted to work, if possible, and if in some kind of occupation that was related to my education. So I ended up in New York City working for a nonprofit organization that focused on Muslim-Jewish interfaith education. And really, it was through that work that I came to realize comparatively just how little research had been done about Muslims in America as compared to the Jewish American community. And so, I realized that was work that I wanted to become involved in. And I myself, I identify as a Muslim American, and I know only my tiny little fragment of my experience as an American Muslim, and I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about how I fit into this larger picture.
Well, I have a side question really quick. As
Yeah.
an American who went and did a graduate degree in Canada, I also did that. I did my master's in Saskatchewan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
How did you find that experience of being an international student for your graduate program from the U.S. going into Canada?
Well, actually, I was an international student for my undergrad and my master's, at least my first master's. So I thought it was a fantastic experience. I loved my time living in Canada, and that is in part why I continue to do research in the U.S. as well as Canada. So, and to be fair, I grew up on the border of the U.S. and Canada. So, I grew up in northern New York, and we would often, as a family, take trips to Ottawa, to Toronto. So it was just a world that I was really familiar with.
I love that. We take our daughter over to Ontario all the time just for no reason. And it's just such a cool way of life to be right there on the border. It makes life so intriguing when you can just say, hey, I'm going to pop over to another country for the afternoon for no reason whatsoever other than to just go. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you had that experience too, because that's how we're raising our kiddo. So I'm really excited to hear that. All right.
Great.
So you are a 2019 fellow for the Sacred Rights Public Scholarship and Religion Group, which is fantastic. And I've loved having conversations with all the fellows. And as a podcaster, like I care a ton about public scholarship, making the work of experts accessible to wider audiences. And I'm curious how and why you became aware of and interested in pursuing this particular opportunity with Sacred Rights.
So I can speak a little bit about my general introduction to public scholarship, and then talk a little bit more specifically about sacred rights.
Totally cool.
So I think, as a scholar and also just as a person, I've always been interested in questions about power. And I've done a lot of work with the late Edward Said, or not work with him, but it would be great.
Inspired by him.
Inspired by the late Edward Said. And of course, Said writes a lot about the relationship between knowledge and power. How is knowledge produced, and how does it circulate? Who has it, and who does it serve? And so, as an academic, I'm a researcher, I'm a teacher, and I am undeniably in a position of power. And I consider it personally, I consider it a moral responsibility
Mm.
to empower others through whatever means I have. And secondly, I also think that it's really easy for scholars, myself included, prior to this experience. I think it's easy for scholars to complain about the ways in which, the media covers religion, particularly Islam, and sort of bemoan how these overly simplistic portrayals of a religion contribute to these, pretty significant misunderstandings about what religions are and how they operate. And so, these kinds of misunderstandings can be at best just annoying, and at worst, they can be really dangerous.
Mm.
Earlier on in my career, I was just sort of waiting for other people to do this kind of work. But I've reached a point in my career where I've realized that I need to be that person. And also, I think I research Islam in North America, and it's hard not to see the very concrete ways that public beliefs and public sentiments about Islam impact real people and real communities. So I heard about sacred rights through a friend and colleague of mine, Megan Goodwin. And once she started describing it, I knew that this was the type of program I really wanted to participate in.
Awesome. Well, and I love Megan's work with the Keeping It 101 podcast as well. They're my pod pals.
Great.
And yeah, so I'm so glad that you had the opportunity to work with her. That's great. So earlier you said that you are Muslim American and you're also a scholar of North American Islam.
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage to balance those like spiritual and academic sides of your life in ways to where like they like might complement each other, but like not distract from one another? What's that like?
Wow. So this is a question that I think, I feel a little hesitant about, because in terms of balancing that religious and scholarly identities, I'm not sure I do that all that well. I think that as I've said now, I think my intellectual curiosity about Islam was inspired partially through just this kind of scholarly experience that I had in undergrad, but also as a Muslim growing up in the United States. And 9/11 happened when I was in college, and I lived in New York City during the NYPD's Muslim surveillance program. And so these things hit me in different ways. And so I find it really hard to separate those parts of my identity. And I'm not really sure there's a point. I don't really think it's necessarily possible. And, in my research, I do field work. I work in Muslim communities. I do ethnographic work, and I conduct interviews. And that question comes to my mind a lot. What are the ethics of all of this? Where do I fit? And frankly, the research that I did for the book that I'm currently working on, I found myself very connected to these communities in both the personal and academic ways.
Did you say that you're doing ethnographic work for your upcoming book?
Yes.
What are, just a little preview, I know the book isn't out, I know you're still working on it, but where did you do the field work for the book? What communities were you working with?
Yeah, great. So the general subject of my research was Muslim leadership education in the United States and Canada. And interestingly, currently the only accredited programs for kind of this higher level of Muslim leadership education are housed in Protestant Christian seminaries. So I was doing field work primarily at 3 field sites. First, Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut. Secondly, Emmanuel College, which is part of the University of Toronto. And then Bayan, Claremont, which was affiliated with the Claremont School of Theology.
Awesome. Cool. Well, whenever the book is coming out, I'll have to have you back on the show and we can do
I
a
love that.
total hour-long feature just about the book. That'll be exciting. So
That's
for a
great.
part 2, we'll do that in the future.
Sounds
So
good.
for now, what I want to do is I want to focus a little bit on some public work that
Mhm.
you have recently put out. And it's about politics. And so we're in an election year. This is a weird election year. It just keeps
Mhm.
getting weirder. We're recording this on May 4th. And currently we're at the height of the pandemic where we're losing between 1 and 2,000 Americans per day. And yet in 6 months, allegedly, we will be going to the polls to vote.
That's right.
And I know that you have a little bit of interest around politics with regards to Islam in North America as well.
Mhm.
And I recently read a really cool piece that you did in the Washington Post about Senator Bernie Sanders and his presidential campaign's ability to reach the Muslim vote in a way that you had not really seen before. And the article that you put out is called Bernie Sanders has brought out the Muslim vote in ways I've never seen before. So I just, said that right back to you. And I will put a link to this article in the show notes for all listeners, so you can check this out after you listen to this episode. But so Sanders now, for all intents and purposes, has ended his presidential campaign as of this recording in May. But his impact is undeniable among many American demographics. And so, I mean, I was born in '83, and so people my age were, flocking to Sanders like wild. So you start the piece at the Islamic Society of North America convention,
Mhm.
and you write how there are 30,000 people at this event, and I've never heard of it. What is the Islamic Society of North America, and why were you there?
Right. Okay. So the Islamic Society of North America is a kind of umbrella organization that was started, I believe, in 1981. But it grew out of this Muslim Student Association movement that started in the 1960s. And it's known as ISNA, for those in the know. So ISNA organizes these major national and regional conferences. It also publishes religious periodicals. I think it's their periodical is called Horizons, and so going to the annual national international ISNA convention is something that a lot of American, Canadian, and even international Muslims do. So this year, as well as last year, the conference happened in Houston, Texas, and I live in San Antonio. So
Super close.
Right. I decided to make a trip with my husband. And I guess I can go back to that previous question about scholarly and personal religious identities. I was there both. I would say maybe 60-40, 60% personal, religious, spiritual attendee, and then 40% scholar.
Okay, cool. And I know that they have some big names there. I think you said that Trevor Noah was there from The Daily Show.
Trevor Noah was the headliner, but the other big draw was this presidential forum that I think actually they only announced a few days or so, maybe a week prior to the conference. So this was kind of a surprise that really got people excited, and it was extended to the invitation for speakers was extended to all of the Democratic presidential candidates. Yes.
Okay. Well, something I'm also curious about is the demographics of the American Muslim voting bloc. Can you tell us a little bit about the demographics of this bloc?
Yeah, the Muslim American voter registration by and large has been pretty low. But I think recently a political advocacy group called Engage, Gauge, reported that Muslim Americans voted 25 points higher during the 2018 midterm elections than they did in 2014, particularly in swing states. So another thing to know about them is Muslim American voters tend to skew pretty young. 37% of voting Muslims are under 30, and 80% of voting Muslims are under 50.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is? Is there any indication about why? Why is it so young?
Why is it so young? Well, I think that's probably a pretty complicated question with a long answer, but the short answer to that I can give is, in a post 9/11 reality, the only other thing that could have brought Muslims out in the numbers that they've been coming out is the election of Donald Trump. And I'm pretty sure that younger Muslims, are appealing to Bernie Sanders demographic. So that's specifically about Bernie Sanders, but also the kind of complex histories, particularly of immigrant Muslims and also African American Muslims of older generations. I think there is a kind of distrust of politics, mainstream politics. And that's something that we can see in various parts of Muslim majority countries. And I could go on, but
Sure. I mean, it's really interesting. So next, I think that many Americans might assume that American Muslims would be classified as socially conservative for whatever that means. Yet you write of Muslim Americans being excited for Bernie Sanders, even going so far as to call him Uncle Bernie, which was awesome.
Bernie, yeah.
So there are signs of this, you write, that occurred in the 2016 election, but can you tell me a little bit about how you came to be aware that Muslims in the U.S. are paying attention and flocking to progressive politicians?
Right. Well, so a study was published by the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, and it reported that Muslim voters, particularly after 9/11, were generally more liberal than other Americans altogether. And I think American Muslim voters tend to be very progressive on certain issues like healthcare, immigration, criminal justice reform, climate change, and they also, perhaps unsurprisingly, identify bigotry and discrimination and civil rights concerns as some of the most pressing issues in the United States, second only to the economy. So I think it's pretty easy to see where those concerns align with Sanders' platform. And, especially for these young Muslim voters, like I mentioned a moment ago, they said that Sanders' campaign best reflected these interests.
Well, and what's interesting to me is I'm putting together a story in my head right now. Like I'm getting some memories from when I started this show. I interviewed a friend of mine who is a Midwestern Muslim in her 20s, who I had on this show in the very early stages of this podcast in 2017. And one of the things that she talked about most in my conversation with her is just how important she finds climate justice to be to her and her spiritual beliefs and the ways that she sees the world as a steward of the planet. And so now I'm thinking oh, wow, this is making so much sense now.
Yeah, I think that's right. Concerns about the environment, and again, I hate to sort of beat this point to death, but I think all of these issues just came into much sharper focus post Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you start a presidency on day one with a travel ban that targets Muslim majority nations, it's kind of hard to unsee that once you've seen it,
That's right.
Yeah. So Sanders' campaign for the 2020 election, which he has since suspended, but apparently he did a lot of things right. So I'm curious about what you think Sanders did well to attract Muslim Americans to his voting bloc that future candidates in progressive politics might emulate and seek to learn from?
Right. Well, I think the easiest way I could put it is that a lot of American politicians tend to spend their time talking a lot about Muslims. And Bernie Sanders was one of the only contenders in the Democratic primary race that spoke to Muslims, that genuinely seemed interested in speaking to Muslims. And I think that's evidenced, if I can go back to that moment at the ISNA conference. As I said, all of the Democratic primary candidates were invited, but only Bernie Sanders and Julian Castro, who, of course, dropped out much earlier in the race, they were the only ones to accept the invitation. So I think that for many Muslims in the United States, that alone spoke volumes. But apart from that, Bernie Sanders addresses a lot of the issues that I think are of particular concern to many American Muslim voters. I think his staunch opposition to Trump's Muslim ban, that's one thing. He vowed to reverse that at the outset of his presidency, were he to win. And then he also addresses multiple issues that get really relatively little traction or attention in mainstream American politics or in the media. So he has spoken about China's mass internment of Uyghur Muslims. He's spoken about India's move to strip Muslim-majority Kashmir of its semi-autonomous status. He's spoken about the humanitarian crisis associated with the civil war in Yemen. And he also speaks about Palestinians as human beings who are deserving of rights. And I think most strikingly, Bernie Sanders has pointed out this kind of hypocrisy of American politicians who support the things like this, the war in Iraq, while turning a blind eye to so many of the human rights violations that you see perpetrated by places like Saudi Arabia, which is a key U.S. ally. Mm-hmm. So I think in addition to those issues, Sanders is just perceived of as someone who is insanely, remarkably consistent. He doesn't have the same kind of doublespeak associated with a lot of politicians. And many of the issues that I mentioned just a moment ago, American politicians are terrified of even saying the names of those countries or those peoples. And so, it seems like a very brave thing to do, to speak publicly and consistently about these issues.
And I'm definitely not the type of person who will, condemn somebody for changing their mind. Mm-hmm. And it's like, but Bernie Sanders doesn't seem like he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Like he's not like voting for drone strikes and wars in foreign countries. And then 10 years later saying, oh, I have to regret all of these decisions that I made whenever I was voting for or against something. Like you see so many other people doing, saying, oh, it was a mistake, I regret it. But Bernie Sanders is like, he's got that record to stand on.
Right. Or those politicians may not actually even, take responsibility for having these, what come to be unpopular stances on issues.
Well, and something else that he did is he's not just speaking to Muslims. I feel like he's speaking with Muslims. Like, was his campaign is his campaign manager Muslim? I can't remember.
Yes, actually. So that's something that I forgot to mention, was that his campaign manager, whose name is Faiz Shakir, was an American Muslim lawyer. Mm-hmm. So that seemed like a significant move as well.
That's intriguing. Okay, well, and we also have one notable American Muslim who is in the media constantly and is berated constantly, Rashida Tlaib from Michigan's 13th district. Mm-hmm. and she said that Sanders wouldn't sell out the American Muslim population. And you've gone through so many reasons why American Muslims are so confident in Sanders. Do you have any additional things to add, like based on Tlaib's words or based on Representative Ilhan Omar's statements about Sanders over the years? Like, is there anything else that we should know about support from within the party towards Sanders?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In addition to all of the issues that I already spoke about, there were lots of important political endorsements by Muslim political leaders like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who announced their support for Sanders earlier on this year. I think at this kind of important moment after Bernie Sanders defended these congresswomen against Donald Trump, who told them to go back to their country, go back to actually where they came from. And so, yeah, there are other Muslim politicians who are perhaps less well known, or even people like Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison.
Keith Ellison.
There are and lots of prominent names in Muslim nonprofit organizations or activist communities like Linda Sarsour, who really see Bernie Sanders as, again, consistently championing these often marginalized voices. And an argument that you hear coming from the Sanders campaign is that, there has to be this willingness to really lift up and engage communities of color, whether Muslim or otherwise. So, yeah.
Well, okay. So now that you are a person who writes about Islam in North America, oftentimes for popular publications like the Washington Post. And I'm not sure if you paid attention to this, but your article has a vigorous comment section on the Washington Post website. And I went through today and I was scanning through some of them. There's like 120 something comments.
Oh boy.
Yeah, maybe that's news to you. As a public facing scholar on North American Islam, I'm curious what you see as your responsibility or not to wade into the discussion sections of things that you write, like on like in public platforms like the Washington Post.
That's an interesting question. I did at the very, right after the piece went up on Washington Post, I did look at some of the comments. But I have to be completely honest, I just found them, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, I found them reflective of that extreme divisiveness in American society, culture, politics at this current moment. And so, like some other people, I, during this campaign, the Democratic primary campaign, put a limit on the amount of media that I could engage with per day.
Yeah.
And comment sections, as we all know, can be particularly terrible for, creating a kind of uplifting perspective on humanity. And so, on the one hand, yeah, I think it is the responsibility. I think I do have a responsibility for engaging in conversations that are generated by my public scholarship. But I think that at the end of the day, scholars, particularly women scholars of color, need to worry a lot about self-preservation as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well. Being a woman Muslim professor, I feel like that is something that I could never understand what that feels like. Do you get like hate mail in your school email and things like that too?
You know what? I'm surprised that I don't get more hate mail, but I think that as I do more and more public scholarship, that will change.
Interesting. Well, what are you, like, I know you mentioned the book earlier. I know that you're working really hard on that. What are some of your plans for what you want to write about more in the future for, like, maybe some public, publications?
hmm well, really, the reason why I focus on Muslim leadership in the U.S. and Canada for my book is because I think um, of this larger question about where Muslims fit in the North American narrative, in the American narrative, in the Canadian narrative, and this perceived precariousness of Muslims in North America. Particularly after the wake of the election of Donald Trump. And so, right now, I think my focus is completely on the book. But I can see myself exploring some more of these grassroots organizations like those that supported Bernie Sanders playing a part in my future research.
Awesome. Well, I'm curious if you can, share where people can find your work if they want to know more about what you're doing. Do you have any like social media or anything that you engage on, or like H Commons or anything like that?
Right now, I think probably the best place to find my work is on Twitter. So my handle is at Sajida Jalalzai, and I'm sure you'll have the spelling of my name on
Yep.
your site. So that's where you can find me.
Did I follow you on Twitter? Did we follow each other?
I am not sure. I would have to check.
You'll have to find me. It's a little caricature of the top half of my head, surrounded by little religious symbolism. It's a lot of fun. It's classical_ideas. Classical_ideas. Follow me.
Yes.
And follow at Sajida Jalalzai on Twitter. There will be a link in the show notes. Well, this has been really interesting, and I really do mean it when I say I want to have you back on the show sometime to talk about your book whenever you are ready to do that. Dr. Sajida Jalalzai, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas to talk about public scholarship, to talk about the ways that American Muslims are engaging in our political process, and giving us something to look forward to with your fantastic inter-border research that you're doing between the U.S. and Canada. This has been a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com. Or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.